All right, hello my AP Econ students. So here to go over the Unit 3, Practice Free Response and Practice Multiple Choice. First of all, a couple of hints and helpful pieces of information about tomorrow's test, the free response part. So there's going to be 3 questions on tomorrow's free response test. One of the questions will definitely be like a bank balance sheet type question, people putting money in a bank or withdrawing money from their bank. How does that affect the money supply? What's the expansion of the money supply? So you want to know the money multiplier. You want to know all those little nuances. The other 2 questions, you always want to plan on drawing in aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, because you know those are going to show up. I would also be very familiar with money market graphs and loanable funds graphs and how those are influenced by either Federal Reserve actions or by fiscal policy actions. And you may see a Phillips curve on there, so I would refresh yourself to Phillips curves from last unit because that might show up as well, because that's typical macro. It's how everything interrelates and how this affects this and that and that. So I would know kind of all those things because you may see them show up at some point. But without further ado, let's jump into the answers here. As you can see, or an explanation of the answers. So how do we know the reserve ratio? Well, pretty simple. And remember, very important, the reserve ratio only applies to demand deposits. So there are $10,000 in demand deposits. Banks have to keep 2,000. 2,000 is 20% or 0.2. Either is acceptable, but 20% of 10,000 is what they've got to be keeping here. So let's just right now stop. Again, you're almost certain if they give you a reserve ratio, at some point they're going to be asking for a question that involves the money multiplier. So a good reminder of the formula for the money multiplier: 100 divided by the required reserve ratio, which in this case is 20%. So we know our money multiplier is going to be 5, because it's going to come in handy in just a moment. So the Fed here purchases $5,000 worth of bonds from the bank. Now remember, when the Fed purchases or the Fed buys, they're giving money. Remember, when the Fed has money, not in the economy, not in M1, can't be spent. When the Fed buys, they're giving money, so now money's being added to the economy. So how's that going to affect excess reserves? Well, when the Fed buys bonds and they give the banks money, that is not a demand deposit. Okay, so they're not a customer, they're buying. So what we're going to see is excess reserves increase by 5,000 because now the bank has an additional $5,000 that they can do whatever they want with. Okay, so that's 5,000 here. No change in demand deposits though, because that's not a demand deposit. Now, FYI, they didn't ask this, but just to make sure we always meet our golden rule, which is the 2 sides have to balance, we added 5,000 over here. Where does it go over here? Well, you would just have a separate line item that would be Fed securities or something like that. And so that's money, remember, that they ultimately owe to the Fed. And so that $5,000 would go as a liability because at some point the Fed's going to say, hey, we want our money back. And so that's why it's a liability, but it would get its own separate line over there. But it would not be a demand deposit. Now, the maximum amount the money supply can change as a result of the $5,000 purchase. Well, our money multiplier is 5, and remember, and this is important, when the Fed had the money, it was not in the economy. So we start at 0, okay, and then the Fed puts the 5,000 in. It gets multiplied 5 times over, so it grows to 25,000, and we get a full $25,000 expansion in the money supply. That would be different if it was a customer depositing $5,000 in cash in the bank. Okay, if they did that, then we would have started not at 0, but the money supply would have started at 5,000 because the cash was already there. It would have grown to 25,000, and so we would have said the change in was 20,000. So make sure you keep that straight because that may show up. All right, now when the Fed purchases bonds, what happens to, purchases bonds, what happens to the price of bonds in the open market? So remember, and this is important, let me come to my money market graph here just to illustrate this. So the Fed buys bonds. That means that they're going to be putting money in the economy, so the money supply is going to increase as such. And as you can see, interest rates go down. Well, at this point, we know that there is an inverse relationship between interest rates and the money supply. So, interest rates and money supply as well, but interest rates and bond prices. So if interest rates go down, bond prices have to increase. And so that's why, and it says explain, all you have to do is say interest rates went down, so bond prices go up, or they're inverse. Okay, so bond prices increase because interest rates went down. And then here we go, and remember they love to ask this question. I would plan on this question being asked if you have a bank balance sheet type question on a free response. Okay, customer here, who is it? An individual deposits $5,000 cash into her checking account. What is the immediate change on M1? Again, no change. They don't ask you to explain that. If they did, you would just say M1 consists of cash and deposits, and we didn't see a change there because it just went from one to the other. Okay, so no change in the money supply. Again, they love to ask that question. It's one of their faves. All right, so that's our bank balance sheet question. And let's come over here to our money market, loanable funds, and aggregate supply, aggregate demand kind of stuff. So here, part A is pretty simple. It just says, hey, we're in long run equilibrium. What does our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph look like? And it's going to look like this. Now in this one, just to clarify, you do need a long run aggregate supply curve because that's how you indicate that we are at full employment. If you didn't have an LRIS, and some of you on your free response questions didn't put it on there, I don't know that we are at full employment because that's what indicates our full employment output and that we're in long run equilibrium. So basically we're just drawing a regular aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, and that should be good to go. Now letter C says, and again I kind of alluded to the fact that in letter B, which I skipped because of some international stuff we haven't done yet, that when Japan goes into recession, it puts us into recession because I think in part B it indicated that they're a major trading partner with the United States. One of the components of aggregate demand is exports. Well, if Japan's in a recession, they can't buy as many of our goods, and that's going to cause aggregate demand to decrease, and as you can see here, that puts us in recession. Bottom line is we're in recession. So, letter C, what is the Fed going to do when we're in recession? They want to put money in the economy. How do they put money in? They buy bonds. That's the open market operation they would undertake. They didn't ask for an explanation, but you buy, you put money in the economy. Now, what happens to nominal interest rates? Let's go back to our money market graph, and it's going to look exactly like this. Okay, make sure you got your good labels. Nominal interest rate, quantity of money on this axis, of course, money demand and money supply there, and we're going to see an increase. And again, make sure you label those equilibriums. A couple of y'all on your sheet forgot to draw those little dotted lines showing me this is my original interest rate and here's my new one. So that's what our money market graph looks like. Let's see, how is the change in interest rate going to affect aggregate demand? Okay, so the goal of the Federal Reserve action, coming back here, is to increase aggregate demand. Remember, we saw a drop because of Japan's recession. The goal of putting money in the economy, putting more money in banks, lowering interest rates is all intended to get more people to spend. When more people spend, that boosts aggregate demand. And as aggregate demand goes up, from here to here, the price level goes up, and from here to here, the output goes up. So the answer to all of those is increase. Increase aggregate demand, okay, aggregate demand increase, price level increase, real output increase, okay, that's the goal. Define real interest rate. Simply, real interest rate is interest rate adjusted for inflation, or you could say nominal interest rate minus inflation, perfectly acceptable. And then what's going to happen to the real interest rate in the United States? Well, if, coming back to our money market graph, what happened to the nominal interest rate? The nominal interest rate went down, so real interest rate is going to go down. Or, if you apply that to our loanable funds graph, which is this next one, I'm going to zoom this out a little bit, it's a bit big, it's going to help us. Okay, so if you look at our loanable funds graph, what's going to happen as the Fed, remember we increased the supply of money here, so we want to increase the supply of loanable funds here, and when we do that, of course, we see that real interest rates decrease. So either way, you're going to have to see a decrease in real interest rates. Okay, so that's our free response. Hopefully that helps clarify some things if you missed some questions. Let's look at our multiple choice here. So number one, if the central bank significantly increases its sale of bonds. So here the Fed is selling. When they sell, they're getting money. In other words, they're taking money out of the economy. What would be happening in the economy that would make the Fed want to take money out? Probably inflation. They're probably trying to fight inflation. In other words, again, coming back to our everything, as you can see, comes back to our ASAD graph here. So what happens is, if we have a lot of inflation going on and price level has been increasing, the Fed says, hey, let's cool the economy off by taking money out of the economy, raising interest rates. That decreases demand and tries to get those price levels to come back down. So that's why they would do that, most likely. All right, question number 2. If we're in a severe recession, which of the following actions is most appropriate? Best answer here would be B, the combination of the Fed increasing money supply through monetary policy and the government increasing spending through fiscal policy. Both of those would fight a recession. Number 3, if an economy is operating with significant unemployment, which will cause the employment to increase, in other words, which is going to help get us out of the recession, and what's going to cause the interest rate to decrease? Well, again, this has to be a Federal Reserve action because, coming back to our money market graph, or we could use the loanable funds graph as well, either way, if the government is getting involved through fiscal policy, their actions are going to cause interest rates to increase in the economy. On the other hand, when the Fed gets involved and they increase the money supply in response to recession, it causes interest rates to decrease. So it's got to be a Federal Reserve action because the government's going to make those interest rates go up and not down. And so C is our best answer. The Fed is going to buy bonds, put money in the economy, increase the money supply, boost the economy, bring those interest rates down. All right, 4 is kind of tricky the way it's worded. Why are savings accounts not included in M1? Technically, they're not considered a medium of exchange. I would have liked this question better if it said it's not 100% liquid. We talked about the concept of liquidity, but at any rate, you don't walk into a store with a savings account. A savings account, you generally don't have checks that you can write to someone that accesses your savings account or a debit card that accesses your savings account and whatnot. So that's kind of why it's B, which is kind of a weird question, but anyway. Number 5, aggregate demand is growing faster than long-run aggregate supply. So again, what's going to end up happening in our market, like we showed a second ago, aggregate demand is growing. Like I showed with my red line, that's going to cause prices to go up. In order to fight that inflation, much like we did, and I think the first question, the Fed is going to sell securities. Okay, selling securities, taking money out of the economy, trying to get inflation to come down. Number 6, an increase in money demand is going to cause an increase in which of the following? And the best answer here is E, a decrease in bond prices. Because remember, again, coming back to our money market, if the government increases money demand, or if money demand increases, I guess it doesn't have to be the government, that causes interest rates to go up. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. Again, you see that relationship showing up between interest rates and bond prices. So that's why you get letter E. All right, number 7. All right, so here the central bank, which is the same as the Fed, by the way. We call our central bank the Fed. Not everyone titles their central bank, not every country titles their central bank the Fed. So sometimes they just use central bank as a generic, this is the Fed, essentially. So they buy $100 worth of bonds. That means they're putting $100 in the economy. Reserve ratio is 10%, so let's stop right there. Our money multiplier, 100 divided by a reserve ratio of 10 is going to make a money multiplier of 10. So that $100 is going to become $1,000. So demand deposits are going to end up being 1,000. Okay, so that would apply to all the options except for letter E. Now, demand deposits are $1,000 now, and banks have to keep 10%. That means the reserves have to be 100, and that leaves 900 alone out, and that leaves us with letter A. Okay, so that's how you would factor that out. Question number 8, the reserve ratio is 10%, banks keep no excess, and so forth. So here's kind of the same thing we did before. Our money multiplier is going to be 10, because our reserve ratio is 10, so 100 divided by 10. So again, remember you've got $100 in cash, that's already in the economy in our money supply. That $100 in cash gets multiplied 10 times over, grows to $1,000. Okay, now if we started at 100 and we ended at 1,000, our gain was 900. Okay, or our expansion was 900. Okay, so that's again important to keep in mind. Unlike up here, when the Fed put the $100 in the economy, we started at 0 and went to 100, or I'm sorry, went to 1,000. So we get the full effect. Number 9, which of the following is true of quantity of money demanded? B is the best answer here, and again, it's kind of worded funny, but the idea here is when interest rates increase, okay, when interest rates rise, it makes it such that if I hold on to my money, I'm giving up the opportunity to make a good return on it because interest rates are high, right? So that's what they mean when they say the opportunity cost of holding money increases, okay? So bottom line is, when interest rates go up, I don't want to hold on to my money as much because I'd rather put it in a bank, and so that's why my demand for money falls when interest rates rise. Again, it's kind of weird the way that one was worded, but again, hopefully that makes some sense. Here's our typical, remember our formula, real interest rates, real wages, real whatever, equals nominal minus inflation. So we're just going to plug the numbers in. We know that nominal is 10%. We know that inflation is 4%, so 10 minus 4, and we get letter B, which is 6. Number 11, which of the following would most likely cause an increase in interest rates in the short run? Okay, best answer here is D, because if the government borrows money to spend it, if we came to our, again, you could use your probably loanable funds graph would be the most appropriate. If the government's borrowing money to spend it, that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. As you increase the demand for loanable funds, again, you see the interest rates go up because of that. Remember, that can sometimes cause that crowding out. So that's why we got D. Number 12, the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other when they make loans. Remember that if their reserve requirements are not up to par, they have to borrow money. They can borrow money from the Fed. If they borrow money from the Fed, that interest rate is called the discount rate. When banks borrow money from each other, that is called the federal funds rate. Okay, so that's an important difference between those two. Let's see, number 13 here. All right, so this one has some moving parts to it, so let's look at it. So, what's happening? We're at full employment, okay? Policymakers wish to maintain the price levels. Let me stop right there. So in other words, coming back to our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, they do not want price level to go up. So bottom line is when you combine the fiscal policy action and the monetary policy action, one of them is going to increase aggregate demand, okay? And the other one then is going to decrease aggregate demand because by increasing it and then countering that with a decrease, your price level stays or comes right back to where it was. Okay, so that's the first part of it. Understand that one of the actions is going to be contractionary and one of the actions has to be expansionary. Okay, so that's an important part of that question. Now, what does it say the second part is? But want to encourage greater investment. And this is a great reminder. Remember, lower interest rates encourage more investment because businesses often borrow money to increase their capital stock or to build new factories and invest in equipment and things like that. So we want lower interest rates. So we want a canceling out effect in regard to our price level, but we want interest rates to go down. Well, what would make that happen if we go to probably our money market graph is the easiest one to see this on. So what's going to make interest rates go down? Well, if the Fed increases the money supply, that would make interest rates go down. And if money demand decreases, that also would make interest rates go down. Okay, so we start here and we end here, so those actions. So in other words, we want expansionary monetary policy, that's what would boost AD, but then we want contractionary fiscal policy, because contractionary fiscal policy, so again, coming here, The expansionary monetary policy would make AD increase. The contractionary fiscal policy would make AD decrease, so that keeps the price level the same, but in regard to our money market graph, as you can see, interest rates go down. That's going to lead to greater investment. And so at the end of the day, we're going to end up with answer D. Okay, expansionary monetary policy, contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, a lot of moving parts to that question. If you got that one right, good for you, because that's a tough one. All right, Fred Jones. He's got $1,000 he withdraws in cash from his savings account. Okay, now, when he withdraws, so remember, you've got M1 and you've got M2. When he's got that $1,000 in his savings account, it is not an M1. That's an M2 category, right? So we start with $1,000 here, okay? But it's not an M1. When he withdraws the $1,000 from his savings account, now he's holding that in cash. That goes to M1. Okay, so our M1 started at 0, and now it's at 1,000. So our M1 is going to increase, but because M2 consists of M1 already, M2 doesn't change. That money is still considered M2. So best answer here for 14 is B. We see M1 increase because of that, and then no change in the M2. All right, number 15, in the short run, which of the following would occur to bond prices and interest rates if a central bank bought bonds through open market operations? Okay, so buy bonds, that's going to make interest rates go down. Interest rates go down, bond prices go up. Best answer is D. All right, number 16, let's look at this guy. So bank has $800 million in demand deposits and $100 million in reserves. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, so in other words, they have to keep $80 million. If they're keeping $100 million, that means they have $20 million left over. So the best answer is C. All right, number 17, an increase in government spending financed by borrowing will result in which of the following? And so best answer here is B. So again, why do we have this? And this is coming back to what we talked about just a second ago. So what we have is government borrowing money. That will make interest rates go up. Again, you could either look at it here or look at it here is probably the easier way. So demand for loanable funds goes up, interest rates go up. Interest rates go up, we have less investment. Okay, so less investments in capital and machinery and equipment and things like that by businesses, and that means less future growth. Okay, so that's why we got B there. Number 18, contractionary monetary policy combined with an expansionary fiscal policy. What's going to happen is A, increase the interest rate and decrease in investment. So again, coming back to our money market graph. So our monetary policy was contractionary. Money supply goes down. Fiscal policy was expansionary. Money demand goes up. That definitely makes interest rates go up. Again, interest rates go up. We have less investment and less future growth. Okay, so decrease in investment. You're seeing that theme come up a lot. Interest rates and investment and growth. Make sure you know that. That's going to be important for the test. Number 19, assume that Atlantic National Bank has $100,000 in demand deposits, no excess reserves. Okay, so they got $100,000 in their deposits on this side. They have no excess reserves. The reserve requirement is 10%, so they have to have $10,000 in excess reserves. Okay, I'm sorry, in required reserves, nothing in excess. Okay, so this is our required reserves. These are our demand deposits. Customer comes along and says, I want $5,000 of my money. So this now goes to $9,500. Here's the question. Where does the bank get the $5,000 to give the customer? Well, they have nothing in excess to give. So that $5,000 is going to have to come from their required reserves. The required reserves are going to have to go down to $5,000 after they give the customer $5,000 of that. Now that's a problem, because if the reserve requirement is 10% and we now have $95,000, if we have $95,000 in demand deposits, banks need to keep $9,500. Well, they don't have 9,500, they only have 5,000, so they have to increase the reserves by 4,500. Again, this is where that phone call is made, most likely to other banks. Hey, we're 4,500 short, can we borrow money to make sure that we are legal? If banks can't do that, they call the Fed and they say, hey, we need some money. And the Fed says, sure, we've got trillions of dollars, what do you need? 4,500, that's chump change to us, so here you go. All right, and lastly, number 20. So the government finances its spending by borrowing from the public. So again, here you have the government borrowing money to spend. Government increases deficit spending. So what's going to happen to real interest rate and bond prices? Again, real interest rate is going to increase because, coming back once again to here, increased demand for loanable funds with that deficit spending, increase interest rates go up, bond prices go down. That's why you get letter A. All right, hopefully that helps you guys understand, if you missed any of those questions, why they are what they are. And again, if you have any questions, as always, email me or let me know. Otherwise, I'm excited to see you guys back here tomorrow to do some free response. So take care and let me know if you need something.